guys, I hope you're well. So when I first started this blog, 5 years ago now, sort of the aim was kind of to talk about sort of everything that I did in brass bands, just as like my own little personal diary type of thing. But then it kind of expanded and I wanted to use it as a sort of vessel to promote brass bands and what they're all about and why they're so great and why we love them. In order to do that, you have to promote who we are and what we do. And in my day job, as a content writer, my main duty really is to raise awareness of the company that I work for and the products that we sell. So I thought I would use the skills I use in my day job to talk about brass bands. And one of the main things that I do to try and figure out how people find our website and how people find our products is to figure out what people are Googling, what terms are they using, what do they want to know about that product or that brand. And I thought I would apply that to banding and hopefully be able to answer some questions that people are often Googling about brass bands. So what I've done is find some of the most Googled questions about brass bands to see if I can answer them. Now, as a person who's been in brass bands for 16 years now, I'm hoping that I can. So without further ado, these are some of the most Googled questions about brass bands. So the first one is, what instruments are in a brass band? So to help illustrate my point, I've created an illustration, which you can see now, which shows all of the seats in the band. So these are all the instruments that you will find in a band. In the same band, you know, even though it's split into sections, there are individual players within those sections that play different parts. You know, the sections don't all play the same part. So this illustration shows the seats and the hierarchy within brass bands. So as you can see, in the cornet section, although there are 10 players, they're all playing different parts and they've all got different roles within that section. So for example, the soprano cornet, there's only one of them because they play in a completely different key. Really? This is a sock player. This is a sock. No, come back if you're going to have the limelight. You might as well have the limelight.
Hello.
A typical sock player who tries to constantly steal the limelight from the
Obviously.
principal cornet. This is a real life hierarchy here. So I'm a principal cornet, you're a soprano cornet, and there's a constant battle in the cornet section of who is the biggest
I
diva. You don't. You don't. So yes, if you're wondering.
Hello.
And this is also an example of why players in the same section shouldn't date, because there is far too much competition.
I usually win.
Goodbye. Honestly, sock players. Question number 2 was asking who are sort of the most famous brass bands. Now this is kind of a subjective question, I suppose, but in my mind there are only 5 real famous brass bands that I think a lot of people may have heard of for different reasons. So in my mind, the top 5 most famous bands, I would say, obviously the Grimethorpe band. They were the band that played in Brassed Off. They were the ones that played all the music, and they were actually playing in the film. You know, they were the ones that could actually play. Then you've got the Black Dyke band, which are one of the most famous brass bands in the world because they do a hell of a lot of travelling, they do quite a lot of tours, but also they are one of the oldest brass bands in the world. And I'm saying one of the oldest because there's kind of a bone of contention as to whether Black Dyke is the oldest, the Besses of the Barn is the oldest, and Black Dyke was certainly one of the first, if not the first brass band that was ever created. Brighouse and Rastrick band, they are famous for the floral dance, which was a big hit for the band and Terry Wogan in I think it was 1976, if I remember rightly. It was in the 70s, definitely. And they were one of the first bands to kind of get in the charts with the floral dance, and they've been known for that ever since. The next one is the Corey band, who I'll be talking about again a bit later in this video, but they probably are one of the most famous bands because they are the best band in the world at the moment. They are at the top of the tree. There is no one better than them at the moment. They are very, very good, and they also were featured on a couple of TV shows to do with brass bands last year. I think it was Battle of the Bands, where they kind of showed Corey and Striga band going to contests and competing, kind of more in the public eye now because of those TV shows. The final one is potentially the Phones band, I think, because again they've been featured on television before now. They're also one of the best bands in the Northwest, if not the best band in the Northwest, I think. So that, in my mind, is the 5 most famous brass bands. If you differ with my opinion, please let me know in the comments. The next question is, where did brass bands come from? This is quite a long answer, so if you want to pause this video and go and get a brew and a biscuit, by all means please do. So it was a working class kind of tradition that started in the early to mid 1800s. It was kind of a way of people who were working in industry or factories to kind of socialise, and it was also a way to keep sort of working class people out of trouble. It was a distraction to stop them from complaining or causing trouble with sort of the socio-economic issues that were going on at the time. But that was its origins, but little did they know of how big a part of British culture it was going to become. However, sort of in the early to mid 1800s, when brass bands started to become a thing, they would have looked and sounded very, very different to how they sound now, because they didn't have the modern instruments that we have today. So in a brass band sort of in the 1800s, before the invention of modern brass band instruments, we found natural horns, reed instruments, keyed bugles, things that we don't tend to see today. It's funny looking instruments called serpents, which weren't even brass. So they were known more as brass and reed bands before sort of the invention of modern brass band instruments. In terms of the wider community, brass bands were so important because they gave normal people who couldn't afford a ticket to the opera or afford a ticket to the theatre or afford a ticket to go and watch an orchestra a chance to listen to music that they normally wouldn't have had a chance to listen to, such as operas or ballet music. Sort of brass band composers who would have been part of the bands kind of took it upon themselves to arrange this music that was being played in expensive concert halls and opera houses, so the common man could be introduced to serious music, which I think is a wonderful thing. So there wasn't really any female players in brass bands until sort of the suffragette movement, which sort of started to get the ball rolling a little bit, and a handful of female players started to get involved in brass bands. It wasn't until sort of after the World Wars, when men obviously had been sent off to fight, and similar to how women had been brought into factories to work, women were also brought into brass bands to kind of replace the players that who were fighting abroad or unfortunately had been killed abroad. Obviously with sort of female emancipation from like the mid to late, starting in sort of the mid 1900s and sort of the 60s, then more and more women started to get involved in brass bands, but it's still been sort of a male-dominated field up until sort of, I would say, maybe a decade or so ago. When I started playing in brass bands, I sort of saw that most brass bands that I saw were male-dominated, and in my lifetime, I am happy to see that there are so many female banders. And the issue that kind of surrounded females coming into banding is that if you've seen Brassed Off, you know how they say like, you know, banding's a man thing and there's, you know, causes controversy that a female's been allowed in a band. That was real, that happened in real life. And if you want to know more about sort of the controversy that was surrounding females joining brass bands, which is utterly ridiculous, read Richard Evans' book. It's absolutely fantastic. Just talk honestly about trying to invite talented female cornet players into the band who were really, really good, and the issues that surrounded that. You know, there were players that threatened to leave if they invited a female into the band, and this was kind of the issues that many women faced, even up to like the 90s. This was a really big issue of men not wanting women in the band. And sort of even in my lifetime, there were certain top of the tree bands that took the mickey out of any female player that would come and play and make life difficult for them, which is just utterly childish. But thankfully nowadays, that kind of controversy and sexism is beginning to become a minority, if not becoming non-existent, which is good. And there was one thing that I noticed this year at the areas that I was in a section. A lot of the bands had female principal cornets. We're talking a couple of decades ago, that wouldn't have been a thing. The next question was, who is the best band in the world? Now, if you ask any brass bander this question, they're naturally going to say their own, and I'm no exception. However, if we're talking about statistics, the current best band in the world is the Corey Band from Wales, who have literally won everything there is to win. They are at the top of the tree, they have the most points out of any band in the world at the moment. It'll be interesting to see how that might change next year if we're allowed to go back to contesting, but as it stands, they are the best. Now, how do brass bands get points, I hear you ask? Well, not that I'm a fan of comparing music and the arts to football. Hello, Jake Berry MP for Darwin and Rossendale. How are you? Are we still comparing ballet to football? I hope not. But in this circumstance, it is potentially the easiest way to compare the two. So the way that brass bands work is that we're in leagues. So there's 5 leagues, or sections as we call them, which is 4th section, 3rd section, 2nd section, 1st section, and championship section, which is the highest section you can get in. And Corey Band are in championship section and have won everything. So there we have it. Those are some of the most Googled questions about brass bands. How did I do? Did I explain okay? Do you reckon I did a good job? If you're watching this and you don't know a lot about brass bands, I know that if you're a bander you obviously will, but if you aren't in brass bands, did you learn anything new? Was this useful? Did I answer some of the questions you've Googled about brass bands? I hope this was useful, and now it's time for my new segment on this channel, which I explained in my story of the last post video, which was I filmed a couple of weeks ago, which is called Shine a Spotlight, which basically is where I take a bit of time to tell you about a charity and what they do and how they can help you, and if you are feeling generous, how you can help them. So today I want to shine a spotlight on a charity called Papyrus. So suicide, sadly, is the biggest killer of both male and females under 35, which is a horrible thing to think about. And the aim of Papyrus is to prevent young people taking their own life. And I know suicide is never a nice thing to talk about, but it's a thing that exists, sadly. And especially with this year being as tough as it is, a lot of young people have been struggling. And one of the main kind of perpetrators for mental health issues with young people is those who are students who have gone back to university only to be told that they can't go home and they can't socialise and they are basically confined to their rooms, which for anybody that is not good for your mental health. And Papyrus have noticed an increase in people calling into their helpline who are students who are struggling, and unfortunately this year there has already been too many students who sadly have struggled and have taken their own life. So this is something that we need to stop, and Papyrus can help change that. They're also trying to shatter the stigma around suicide and mental health problems, which is something that just needs to go. So if you are a young person, whether you're a student or whether you're just a young person who's struggling with life in general, maybe you've had issues at work or issues with your family and you need someone to talk to, Papyrus run a helpline called the HOPEline, which I will put the phone number here. If you would like to help Papyrus, there is a donation link on the website, which again I will put here, and I will link that down below as well, where you can donate in a variety of different ways. You can donate through bank transfer, you can donate through texting, you can donate through PayPal, I think. So there's lots and lots of ways that you can give if that's something that you would like to do this year. Maybe instead of buying Christmas cards, you could donate the money that you would spend on Christmas cards to Papyrus. But that's it for this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you next time.